Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her during morning handoff, 3 days into her placement at Cedar Creek Medical. Sarah Chen didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply charted the observation in her mind and moved to the next patient. The pediatric wing hummed with that particular silence of 200 hours, fluorescent lights thrumming their electronic song above corridors that smelled of antiseptic and something underneath it, something like hope mixed with desperation. Sarah walked these hallways with deliberate invisibility, her navy scrubs unremarkable, her face always angled slightly down, her movements those of someone who belonged nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Eyes that had seen combat zones from Sanjin Valley to Fallujah kept their gaze fixed on charts and monitors and the small details that most people missed. That was the point. 8-year-old Marcus Reston lay in room for 12, third bed on the left, his small frame barely raising the blankets. The darkness didn't bother him anymore. He'd had 3 years to adjust to it. His chart told a story in medical shorthand that made Sarah's jaw tighten with controlled fury. Bilateral retinal detachment. Failed surgical repair. Experimental vision restoration protocol, Phase 2B. 3 months of treatment under Dr. Pierce. No improvement. Deteriorating baseline. The notes were clinical, precise, and utterly incomplete. Sarah had reviewed the secure tablet hidden in the false bottom of her medication cart, the one that connected to a naval intelligence server and not Cedar Creek's patient system. The real story was there. Pierce had billed military insurance for 17 procedures. Insurance had paid. Insurance always paid when the paperwork was perfect. But the procedures themselves followed no documented protocol. The experimental implant Marcus received was 3 generations old, its efficacy rate sitting at 12% in peer-reviewed literature. Pierce was billing cutting edge. He was delivering obsolete. And Commander Jake Reston, Marcus's father, had died in Tikrit before he could fight for his son. That part of the intelligence file was sanitized for civilian consumption. Captain Sarah Chen knew the real version. Jake Reston had been her teammate. She'd been holding his femoral artery closed with a tourniquet while Navy corpsmen prepped for transport when the second IED detonated. She'd been holding him for 18 seconds before the blood loss exceeded what any trauma surgeon could fix. She'd been the one to cut his dog tags and place them in the command's hands. She'd been the one to salute at the memorial service in dress blues, invisible among dozens of others, her presence required by operational security and her absence required by her cover. His son was blind because a surgeon decided to experiment with insurance money. Sarah approached Marcus's bed and checked the fall line, the bedside monitor, the fluids running at 20 milliliters per hour. The boy didn't stir. Sleeping the shallow sleep of the hospitalized child, his breathing steady but his body tense with the kind of pain medication barely touched. His grandmother sat in a vinyl chair beside the bed, her head tilted back at an angle that suggested sleep had finally claimed her. Sarah had read the grandmother's file too. Margaret Chen, no relation, just a shared surname across millions, had sold her car and maxed 2 credit cards to fly from Sacramento for the procedure. The commanders at SEAL Team 3 had made discreet inquiries. The boy's case was known. The boy's father was a legend. And the boy was being failed by a surgeon more interested in billing codes than outcomes. Sarah's hands moved with unconscious precision as she adjusted the monitor settings, checked the surgical site where Pierce had placed the experimental implant, and charted observations that most night nurses would skip. The bandaging around Marcus's eyes was sterile, correct in its placement, useless in its function. No vision restoration. No improvement in light perception. The baseline had actually declined. According to the billing records, Pierce was planning Phase 3B next month. Another procedure. Another $47,000 from the military health insurance system. But that wasn't the worst part. The real nightmare sat in Pierce's secure files, encrypted and protected by his access credentials. 18 months of procedures. 42 patients. 34 had 0 improvement. 8 had deteriorated. Not one had achieved the 60% vision restoration that Pierce's published protocols promised. And somewhere in that file was a note from a credentialing committee member stating that Pierce's mentor from Johns Hopkins, a towering figure in ophthalmology, had warned him about protocol deviations. Pierce had continued anyway. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the 4 tape, checking the insertion site for any signs of infiltration. Her hands were steady. They always were. Muscle memory from 100 field hospitals in combat zones, from emergency department shifts at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, from the kind of trauma nursing that taught you control above all else. Pain is data. Panic is luxury. Hands move. Lives continue. She was 3 hours into her shift when Dr. Pierce arrived for early morning rounds, his polished leather shoes clicking against tile with the sound of a man who'd never walked through sand or blood. He swept into the pediatric unit at 0530, still dark outside, still quiet enough that his voice carried the weight of a scalpel. Sarah was charting at the nursing station, her tablet passive before her, her eyes on the monitor displays above the desk. She didn't look up when his shadow fell across her station. "How's our experimental patient progressing?" Pierce asked, his tone carrying that particular inflection that made the question itself an accusation. He was looking at her now, his gaze the kind that measured people the way surgeons measured anatomy, clinical, detached, already certain of what he'd find. Vital stable. Pain managed. No new symptoms overnight, Sarah said, her voice pitched low, deferential, the voice of someone who existed in the basement of Cedar Creek's hierarchy. The implant site looks clean. Pierce leaned over the monitor, his designer brand cologne preceding him like a chemical announcement. Tom Ford. Expensive. The kind of scent that came from someone who could afford failure because failure was always someone else's problem. Bring me the latest visual acuity assessment. I want to see if we're seeing any improvement. There's no improvement documented, Doctor, Sarah said, still not lifting her eyes. She kept her tone level, professional, empty of judgment. The baseline continues to decline. Last measured light perception was down 8% from admission. Pierce's jaw shifted. Then your documentation is sloppy. These results don't align with the clinical picture. He straightened, and Sarah heard the subtle sound of his tie being adjusted, that sharp whisper of silk against cotton. Maybe night shift competence is overrated. I'll need better notes, Nurse Chen. Actual observations, not assumptions. The words landed exactly as he intended them to land. They were meant to establish hierarchy. They were meant to establish her position as subordinate, unreliable, the kind of person whose testimony would be dismissed in any proceeding that mattered. Sarah continued charting for precisely 3 more seconds, allowing silence to do the work of acceptance, and then she nodded once. Understood, Doctor. What they didn't know was that every single note Sarah Chen had written about Marcus Reston's care was being uploaded to a naval intelligence server at 0600 hours. What they didn't know was that her documentation was being cross-referenced with peer-reviewed literature, insurance claims databases, and a parallel investigation that had been running for 18 months. What they didn't know was that the quiet night nurse they dismissed had written down the precise angles of each surgical approach, the exact medications administered, and the billing codes for procedures that had no corresponding clinical notation in the medical record. Pierce moved down the unit, his presence clearing the hallway the way a shark's arrival clears shallow water. Sarah waited until his footsteps had rounded the corner toward the physician's lounge, and then she allowed herself one long, controlled breath. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the weight of operational security, of a cover that couldn't break, of a mission that was bigger than her anger and sharper than her grief. She finished her charting, locked her tablet against her hip, and moved toward the break room for a coffee that would taste like burned filter and mercy. That was where she encountered him. The man in the corner, early 70s, with the kind of weathered face that belonged to someone who'd spent decades in harsh terrain and harder situations. He was waiting for the coffee machine, and Sarah nearly passed him without acknowledgement, but something in his bearing, the way he stood, the angle of his shoulders, made her pause. Combat medic. She could read it in the muscle memory of his posture, in the callus that still marked his hands even in retirement. His daughter worked here. Sarah had seen the visitor log and done the due diligence required of someone operating under naval intelligence protocols. Retired Army Special Forces medic, 34 years of service, 3 tours of Afghanistan, 2 tours of Iraq. Volunteer grandfather. Widowed 8 years. Clean record. No security concerns. Coffee's bad, isn't it? The man said, not looking at her, just speaking to the general direction of the break room. Universally bad, Sarah agreed, her voice still pitched at that low, unremarkable register. Hospital coffee exists as a cautionary tale. The man smiled, and she saw the lines around his eyes deepen. They were the kind of lines earned in places where smiling was a reflex of survival, where you made jokes because if you didn't, the darkness won. He grabbed a cup and turned to face her directly. You just finished a laceration repair on the pediatric ward. I watched you through the observation window. My daughter's the floor supervisor. He poured coffee with steady hands. Nobody I've seen in civilian practice ties a field suture like you do. Forward surgeon technique. Tension calibration for rapid field deployment. Minimal scar tissue risk. He paused, and she watched his eyes flicker across her face, registering details. Who taught you to tie like a forward surgeon? Sarah's hand froze halfway to the coffee machine. This was the moment where cover could fracture. This was the moment where a direct question forced a direct answer, and any answer that wasn't truthful carried risk. Long time ago, she said quietly. Different place. Different job. The old medic nodded slowly, like a man who'd heard evasion before and understood its language. Sanjin? Fallujah? Both, Sarah said, and then corrected herself, pulling back into the default position. I trained extensively. Military medical protocols were part of my nursing certification. He didn't push. Combat veterans understood the weight of operational security even when it was dressed up as civilian practice. He just handed her the coffee pot and said, well, whoever trained you trained them right. That boy in 412, Marcus, he's lucky you're on night shift. Then he walked out of the break room, leaving the coffee pot in her hands and a question hanging in the air like cordite smoke. Sarah stood alone in the break room for exactly 4 seconds. Then she returned to the pediatric ward and continued her work with the precision of someone operating under controlled conditions. She checked the monitors. She reviewed the charts. She did the invisible work that nurses do in the deep night hours when hospitals are at their quietest and most dangerous. And she touched the folded flag in her locker. It was during the midshift break, at 0330 hours, when she opened that locker and her fingers found the small piece of fabric tucked behind her extra stethoscope. The flag was from a funeral. It had been pressed into her hands by a command officer who understood what that flag represented. It had belonged to her teammate. It had belonged to the man whose son now lay 3 floors above, blind and failing, cared for by a surgeon who saw insurance claims instead of children. Sarah's fingers traced the triangle fold, the precise military creases, the weight of it in her palm. No one else knew the flag was there. No one else knew what it meant. But she touched it every shift, a ritual that anchored her to the mission, to the 18 months of undercover work, to the reason naval intelligence had placed her at Cedar Creek Medical as a low-level night nurse instead of as the captain with surgical credentials that would have gotten her promoted 5 times over. The flag was a reminder. It was a ticking clock. It was a promise kept to someone who would never keep another promise to anyone. She closed her locker with careful precision and returned to the pediatric ward, where 8-year-old Marcus Reston slept in darkness and his grandmother kept vigil in a vinyl chair, and Sarah Chen began the next rotation of vitals, each note sharper than the last, each observation more lethal than the one before. Dr. Pierce swept through the pediatric ward at 6:19 p.m. with the precision of a man accustomed to parting crowds. 5 residents followed in his wake, clipboards held like shields, their white coats crackling with starch and deference. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he stopped at Marcus Reston's bedside, where the 8-year-old lay still beneath a cotton blanket, bandages fresh over eyes that had known only darkness for 3 years. Marcus's grandmother rose from the vinyl chair beside the bed, her posture straightening the way it always did when authority entered a room. She had learned, in the 6 weeks since arriving at Cedar Creek, that Dr. Pierce commanded something beyond respect. It was the kind of attention people gave to men who controlled the narrative. Sarah stood at the medication cart, the prescribed eye drops, Tebramycin 0.3%, 3 drops every 4 hours, already drawn into the sterile applicator. She had checked the prescription against the physical order twice, the way she checked everything. The way combat medics checked ammunition counts before a raid. Attention to detail was the difference between a successful mission and a flag folded into a triangle. "Good evening, Mrs. Reston," Pierce said, his voice modulating into the warm tone reserved for families with insurance that didn't require creative billing. "I wanted to review Marcus's progress with our residents. This is an extraordinary case, a rare opportunity to observe experimental regenerative protocols." He gestured toward the array of young physicians. "Observe closely. You won't see this technique everywhere." Sarah moved toward the bedside with the eye drops, her movements economical, learned through countless hours in field hospitals where wasted motion meant wasted seconds. She had administered these drops 17 times in the last 4 days, always following the protocol Pierce had written, head tilted back slightly, drops placed in the inferior fornix, gentle closure of the lids for 60 seconds to allow proper absorption. The technique was fundamental. Unchanging. Correct. Nurse Chen, Pierce's voice cut through the room like a scalpel finding the exact tissue that needed severing. "Perhaps you could explain to our residents why you're using the wrong application technique." Sarah's hands remained steady. Not a tremor. Not even the smallest hesitation. She had weathered worse questions in rooms with actual bullets. "I'm following your written protocol from this morning, Doctor." Her voice came out level, professional, the voice of someone stating a fact rather than defending herself. Pierce's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He hadn't expected her to respond at all. He moved to the chart, his chart, technically, but he held it like a prosecutor holding evidence, and began flipping pages with theatrical precision, his residents leaning in as though the performance required visual documentation. "This is exactly what concerns me about nurses who think they know better than physicians," he announced, his volume carrying beyond the curtained area. Other nurses at the station paused, pens hovering over papers. "Ms. Chen here seems to believe her associate's degree qualifies her to question my methods. The application angle in the literature I cited is clearly specified at 42 degrees. Not 40. 42. Sarah's jaw clenched. Just slightly. The kind of tension that lived in muscle memory, in the small places where discipline held rage in a choke hold. But her face remained blank as surgical tile. Her eyes never left the work, the sterile field, the drops, the patient who would not remember her face. "I'm following the measurement you provided," she said quietly. The words came out flat. Factual. A statement filed away like evidence. "This is precisely why patient safety protocols exist, nurse." Pierce turned to Mrs. Reston, and his voice shifted again, becoming solicitous, almost protective. "I apologize that you have to witness such basic nursing incompetence. Rest assured, I'll be addressing this with the charge nurse immediately. You can expect a higher standard of care going forward." Mrs. Reston nodded uncertainly, her hand clasping and unclasping the fabric of her cardigan, blue, thermal, from the discount store 5 blocks from her motel room. She had buried one son already. She could not afford to believe that Cedar Creek Medical, that Dr. Pierce, that anyone here might be capable of anything less than perfection. Sarah finished the eye drops. Closed her eyes. Counted to 60 in the silence that Pierce had created. The room had gone dead quiet except for the ventilator wheeze from the patient in the adjacent bed and the rhythmic beeping of a cardiac monitor 3 rooms down. When she opened them, Pierce was already sweeping back toward the corridor, his residents hurrying to maintain formation, their clipboards rustling like leaves before a storm. She did not watch them leave. She gathered the empty applicator, disposed of it in the biohazard bin with the same care she would have used disarming an IED, and excused herself from the room. 2 hours later, at 8:52 p.m., Sarah entered the break room for her mandated meal period. The space was small, refrigerator humming in the corner, microwave with a permanent stain across its window, a table that had hosted 1,000 conversations between people who understood the specific exhaustion of caring for the dying. 4 nurses sat at the table. Conversation stopped the moment the door swung open. One of them, Jennifer from the day shift, had worked beside Sarah for 3 weeks. They had eaten lunch together. Jennifer had shown her photographs of a daughter who played soccer, a husband who worked in insurance. Jennifer gathered her belongings. No eye contact. No words. One by one, the others followed. Sarah recognized the choreography of self-preservation. She had seen it in Tikrit, too, when interpreters stopped showing up for briefings, when locals began crossing to the other side of streets, when associations became liabilities. Pierce's message had been clear in the hallway conversation sheet overhead at the shift change. Associating with Nurse Chen would be interpreted as a lack of professional judgment on your part. The door closed on silence. Sarah opened her lunch container, rice, grilled chicken, vegetables she had cut that morning in the apartment she barely occupied. She ate with mechanical precision, her hands perfectly steady, and felt nothing at all because feeling anything was a luxury she could not afford. The next morning, when Sarah arrived for her shift at 6:15 a.m., a formal write-up had appeared on the unit board, visible to every staff member who passed through the break room. The paper was white. The text was black. The tone was procedural. Nurse S. Chen, failure to follow physician orders, inadequate documentation, patient care concerns under clinical review. All future care assignments pending administrative evaluation. Effective immediately. She read it twice. The allegations were precise and entirely false. She had followed every written order. Her documentation was meticulous, every detail recorded, every interaction timestamped. She had learned in field hospitals that paper trails were survival mechanisms. Records saved lives. Records also saved careers, if you needed them to. But no one knew that. No one at Cedar Creek Medical understood that the nurse they had been warned away from had once supervised trauma protocols for the most elite combat medical teams in the world. That her inadequate documentation had been reviewed and approved by surgeons at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. That the procedures she had questioned weren't questions at all, they were professional concerns filed through proper channels to commanders who understood her real purpose here. She folded the write-up, tucked it into her pocket, and moved to the medication cart to begin the morning preparation. At 2:06 p.m., during her break, Sarah went to her locker. The folded flag was still there, pressed against the cool metal backing, precisely where she had placed it 6 weeks ago. It had arrived in a box with a formal letter, returned from someone's last assignment in the Middle East. The flag was the color of impossible choices, of servicemen and servicewomen who had understood that some operations could not be conducted in uniform. That some heroes walked among the living and some remained frozen at the moment they made their final choice. She touched it once. Just once. Her fingers registered the texture, precise creases, the weight of careful folding. Then she closed the locker, locked it, and returned to the ward where Marcus Reston slept in darkness and where Dr. Pierce's experiment continued uninterrupted. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sarah had 18 more days before her handler authorized the next phase of documentation. 18 days watching a child suffer under a system built by a man who understood that money moved faster than truth. 18 days of perfect silence. 18 days of becoming invisible. That was the mission. That was always the mission. And Sarah Chen, Captain, United States Navy, had never failed a mission in her life. The charge nurse, Sandra, stood at the unit board with a red pen. Sarah watched from across the nurses' station, watching the reassignments materialize like a surgical team being carefully dismantled. Marcus Reston's name. Moved to Bay 7. New primary nurse, Jennifer Chen, no relation, no connection to Sarah, no history with the boy. The message was architectural. Precise. Institutional. Sarah didn't flinch. She moved to the coffee maker and poured exactly 6 ounces into a paper cup. Her hands remained steady, which took more discipline than it appeared. The tremor wasn't fear. It was restraint. By Wednesday evening, the pediatric floor had been surgically reorganized. The respiratory therapist who normally managed the extubation protocols was transferred to critical care. The lab tech who pulled Marcus's blood work rotated to days. The charge nurse who'd trained Sarah for 3 months, suddenly volunteering for a conference in San Francisco. One by one, the witnesses disappeared, like breadcrumbs being swept from a path. Sarah's access card stopped working at 2,142 hours. She tried Marcus's room, the door beeped red. Unauthorized. She tried the charting terminal in the doctor's lounge. Access denied. The surgical logs for the experimental implant procedure, restricted file, physician eyes only. Pierce hadn't shouted. He hadn't needed to. He'd simply picked up a phone, made 3 calls, and rebuilt the hospital's nervous system around her absence. This was competent villainy. Not rage. Strategy. The kind of calculated dismantling that came from someone with institutional power welded tight like titanium plate. One phone call to the credentialing director, one whispered warning about her questionable clinical judgment, and every door slid shut. The hospital didn't need to fire her yet. They just needed to make sure she couldn't see, couldn't help, couldn't interfere. Sarah documented her shift in the break room alone, as she had been doing for 4 days. The other nurses left belongings on the table as if they'd evacuated suddenly. The smell of stale coffee and the fluorescent hum of the overhead lights created a vacuum that swallowed sound. She charted vitals for patients on the orthopedic wing, patients she'd never met, patients who'd never meet her eyes because their assigned nurses made certain of it. At 2,347 hours, the page came through. Code to the nurse's station. It was Marcus's grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor Reston, a woman whose face carried the particular erosion that came from burying a son and now watching his child suffer. The voice through the phone sounded like a rope fraying. Please. Someone. Marcus is complaining of terrible headaches. His eyes are sensitive to light. He keeps saying his head feels too full. No one is listening to me. Sarah heard the charge nurse respond in the standard voice, reassuring but distant. That's normal post-procedure adjustment, Mrs. Reston. The swelling will subside over the next few days. Dr. Pierce said this was expected. He said that the last 3 times I called. The line disconnected. Sarah sat perfectly still, her pen suspended 3 millimeters above the charting tablet. A headache. Light sensitivity. Pressure sensation behind the eyes. The symptoms arranged themselves in her mind like dominoes standing in perfect formation, each one threatening to topple the next. She pulled up the patient portal, the one accessible to all staff for general observation purposes, not clinical intervention. Marcus's chart showed a single notation from the morning, patient stable, post-operative adjustment proceeding per protocol. No vitals listed. No assessment. No objective findings. The page notation said Dr. Pierce was attending a medical device conference in Phoenix, speaking at 0800 hours tomorrow about innovative payment structures in ophthalmologic care. The charity speaking fee was probably 6 figures. Sarah did the calculation in a room where the lights buzzed like they were slowly dying. An 8-year-old's brain swelling against a titanium implant. A doctor at a conference 600 miles away. An on-call resident too junior to push back. A grandmother whose calls weren't being answered with real medicine, just platitudes and protocol. The next page came at 0031 hours. Same caller. Same desperation. Same non-response from the medical team. Sarah was finishing her shift in 37 minutes. She clocked out at 0630 hours. She was not Marcus Reston's nurse anymore. Her assignment had been surgically removed. Her access was revoked. Her voice had been stripped of institutional weight. She spent her morning driving home through Denver's early darkness, the streets still wet from rain that had fallen while she was inside the fluorescent cave. The city looked like it was bleeding color into the asphalt. She picked up her daughter from her sister's house at 0730, buckled the small body into the car seat, and drove to her apartment. The child asked about breakfast. Sarah made eggs. The child asked about school. Sarah said she'd be staying home today because Mommy wasn't feeling well. It wasn't technically a lie. At her kitchen table, with her daughter watching cartoons in the next room, Sarah pulled out her secured phone, the one that had a number that didn't belong to any phone service, routed through 3 encrypted layers. Her handler picked up after 1 ring, which meant he'd been expecting contact. Patient critical. Deteriorating neurostatus. Implant complication. Need to intervene. Silence across the line. Not the comfortable silence of a colleague considering information. The silence of someone reading the collision between 2 impossible things, a mission and a child's life. 3 seconds stretched like hours. Stand down. He's herniating. Cover blown means investigation dead. Means evidence gets destroyed. Means 23 military families lose justice. You know the calculus. You've always known it. Sarah's jaw tightened in a way that wouldn't have been visible on a camera, but the sensation of it traveled down her spine like a bullet chambering. The boy is 8 years old. And we don't have enough for indictment without 6 more months of documentation. If you move now, if you reveal yourself now, Pierce makes 1 phone call to his medical school roommate on the credentialing committee and the case evaporates. You'll be fired within hours. The investigation gets closed. The evidence gets sealed. 23 families get nothing. The numbers arrange themselves differently now. 23 families. 1 child. Her daughter in the next room, watching cartoon characters sing about friendship. The calculus didn't add up because it wasn't supposed to. It was designed to break the person doing the math. He won't make it to tomorrow, Sarah said. The words were steady. Flat. Delivered like data points that didn't require emotion to be factually true. Then you call the on-call resident and you raise the flag through proper channels. You stay documented. You stay clean. You stay inside the investigation. The on-call resident is afraid of Pierce. That's not your responsibility to solve. Sarah's hand was resting on the folded flag on the kitchen counter, the one her fallen teammate had pressed into her fingers 18 months ago in a hospital in Landstuhl, Germany. The fabric had the weight of a decision that had already been made by someone else. The flag was folded into the precise triangle that military protocol demanded, 13 triangular folds, representing the original 13 states, and 1 final fold to conceal the loose end, the part that wouldn't stay hidden if you looked too closely. I'm going to make it stay inside the investigation, Sarah said, and disconnected the line before her handler could respond. She sat at the table for exactly 4 minutes. Then she showered, changed into scrubs that matched the shift rotation she no longer had, and drove back to Cedar Creek Medical through afternoon traffic that moved like a mechanism trying to prevent her arrival. It didn't matter. Nothing was going to prevent this arrival. The hospital at 1,547 hours had the particular energy of afternoon shift change, some nurses leaving, some arriving, all of them moving with the specific friction of people trained to prioritize protocol over chaos. Sarah Badge swiped into the pediatric wing using her access card, which still worked because the restrictions had been placed on specific rooms and systems, not the building entry itself. 1 gap in their architecture. 1 door left slightly ajar. She found Mrs. Eleanor Reston in the visitors' lounge on the pediatric floor, a woman who looked like she'd been folded in half by the weight of 2 losses. The grandmother's eyes lifted when Sarah approached, and in that moment, something like desperate recognition flickered across her face, the look of a drowning person seeing someone who might understand water. Mrs. Reston, I need you to listen carefully. Everything I say, you need to remember exactly. Sarah's voice had changed. It wasn't the deferential register she'd been using for weeks. The octave had dropped. The politeness had evaporated. What remained sounded like a person who'd made a decision that couldn't be unmade, delivered with the particular calm that comes after passing through the event horizon of consequences. Can I see Marcus? Right now. Eleanor nodded without asking why. She understood something in Sarah's bearing that required no explanation. They moved through the pediatric wing toward the boys' room, and Sarah's hands were already cataloguing what she'd find before she saw it: the darkened space, the small figure under the blankets, the respirations that would be shallow and irregular, the pupil response that would confirm what the symptoms already announced. The room was exactly as anticipated. Dark because light hurt him now. Quiet because the medical team had decided his pain was normal. Small because he was 8 and the hospital bed had been designed for adults, and that mismatch seemed like a metaphor for everything that was about to come undone. Sarah approached the bedside with the unhurried precision of someone moving through a space they'd already seen, and her hands, those steady hands that had held Marines together in Tikrit, that had sutured wounds under desert sky, that had touched the folded flag 100 times in the privacy of her locker, her hands moved toward Marcus Reston's face with the knowledge that she was no longer an undercover nurse in a hospital investigation. She was a captain of the United States Navy. And what happened next would end everything. Marcus Reston's eyes rolled back at 2:36 p.m. Sarah caught it from across the pediatric ward, that subtle flutter of the eyelid, the kind of involuntary movement that meant the brain was screaming. She was updating a chart on a patient 3 rooms down when her body recognized what her mind hadn't finished processing. She moved. The boy lay in the recovery bed, post-op day from Pierce's experimental retinal implant procedure. Routine vitals check. Routine follow-up. Routine until his left pupil dilated to the size of a dime and stopped responding to light. Sarah's hand found his carotid pulse. 118. Climbing. His breathing had shifted, shallow, labored, the kind of respiratory pattern that meant pressure was building inside the vault of his skull. "Get me a penlight," she said to the resident frozen at the monitor. The resident didn't move. Didn't understand that this was not a request. Now. The word carried an edge that made 3 people jump. The resident produced the light. Sarah's fingers were already moving through the assessment: pupil response, extraocular movements, motor function. The right pupil constricted normally. The left remained blown, fixed, a dark void that meant herniation was beginning. Intracranial pressure. Acute. Deteriorating. The implant had shifted. Or failed. Or caused a bleed. The surgical notes didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Marcus's brainstem was being compressed by something that had to come out now, or the boy would be a vegetable if he survived at all. "Call the OR," Sarah said to the charge nurse. "Tell them we need emergency burr hole decompression. Page Dr. Pierce." "He's not. I don't care if he's on Mars. Page him. And get me a neurosurgeon on backup." The charge nurse moved. Sarah's hands were already stripping the old dressing from Marcus's head, her fingers knowing the anatomy the way muscle knows its own weight. The scar from the implant insertion ran along the right temporal region, still pink, still angry. The problem wasn't there. The problem was pressure building in the space between the brain and the skull, and when that pressure exceeded cerebral perfusion pressure, the brainstem would herniate through the foramen magnum like a fist punching through wet paper. Her phone was at her ear before she'd finished the thought. "Dr. Pierce is in a meeting with external consultants. He cannot be. This is urgent. Get him out of the meeting. I'm not authorized." Sarah hung up and handed her phone to the resident. "Keep trying. I'm moving to the OR." The stretcher wheels squeaked against the tile like they were screaming. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead in that specific way that meant the hospital was running full load. Somewhere in the building, Dr. Pierce was sitting in that mahogany conference room on the executive floor, discussing billing codes and insurance pathways with his credentialing committee contact, completely unreachable, completely unavailable, completely unaware that his star patient's brain was dying. Sarah didn't have time for protocol. Protocol was for when patients had time. The OR was already spinning with activity, nurses pulling equipment, the anesthesiologist reviewing Marcus's chart, a neurosurgeon walking in from across the hall. Dr. Valesteros. The only person in the hospital besides Pierce who could authorize a burr hole decompression. He took one look at Sarah prepping the surgical field, sterile technique flawless, positioning already calculated, the trajectory marked mentally against skull anatomy, and said, "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. Yes, Sarah said simply. She didn't say where. Didn't say when. Didn't say that she'd done this in the back of a Humvee driving away from Tikrit with mortar fire cracking the air above them, or that she'd held a Marine skull together with her hands while a medic pushed fluids and a helicopter rotor screamed overhead. Didn't say any of it because there was no time, and because the only answer that mattered was the one already in her hands. The needle went in. 15 gauge, angiocath, calculated entry point at the second intercostal space. The hiss of air escaping. Immediate. Dramatic. The kind of relief that meant she'd called it right. Marcus's oxygen saturation climbed. 68, 74. 82, his heart rate stopped climbing and started dropping back toward normal. His pupils began their recovery, the left one constricting slowly, painfully, but constricting. She'd bought him time. Not survival yet. But time. The burr hole itself took 7 minutes. Dr. Valesteros assisting, watching her hands like he was learning something. The drill hummed against bone. One small circle of skull removed. The membrane beneath exposed and bulging with the pressure that had nearly killed the boy. A tiny amount of epidural fluid, not blood, thank God, but enough to explain the sudden rise in intracranial pressure. The implant must have triggered a localized hematoma, Valesteros said, more to himself than to her. Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She was closing. Sutures laid with the precision of someone who'd practiced on wounds that couldn't afford mistakes. Forward stitch pattern. Not. Cat. Move on. 15 minutes. The entire crisis contained in 15 minutes. Marcus's vitals stabilized. Oxygen saturation 98%. Heart rate 82. Blood pressure 104/68. The blown pupil responsive again, normal again, the pressure relieved and the boy's brainstem no longer being crushed. Alive. He was alive. Sarah was stripping off her surgical gloves when the OR doors exploded open. Dr. Pierce stood framed in the doorway, his face the color of a ripe plum, his voice a roar that didn't sound human. "What the hell do you think you're doing in MY operating room?" Sarah met his eyes. Didn't flinch. Didn't apologize. Saving your patient's life. The moment stretched. Pierce's gaze swept the room, the surgical field, the equipment, the monitoring, the clear evidence of a procedure that had already been completed. Successfully. Without him. His hand moved to his pocket. Cell phone out. Fingers moving. "Security," he said into the phone. His voice had shifted into something worse than rage. Something surgical. "I need security in OR1 immediately. We have an unlicensed person performing major surgery without authorization. Remove her from the building." Sarah stripped her gloves without hurrying. Placed them in the biohazard container. Turned to Dr. Valesteros. "He's stable," she said quietly. "Intracranial pressure relieved. Monitor his neurostatus every 15 minutes. If the pressure rises again, you'll know the hemorrhage wasn't isolated." Valesteros nodded. His expression was unreadable. Pierce was still on his phone. "Jeff, yes, that nurse situation I mentioned. Yeah. It just went criminal. She was in the OR performing an authorized surgery on an experimental case. No, I'm not exaggerating. Get the medical board on the phone. I want a license suspension initiated immediately." 2 security guards appeared. Young. Professional. Apologetic in the way of men who had to follow orders they didn't fully understand. Sarah walked past them without being escorted. Didn't wait to be removed. Moved like someone who'd already accepted what came next, the way soldiers accept the weather. That night, she sat at her kitchen table at 2:14 p.m. Still in scrubs. Blood under one fingernail that she couldn't quite clean out. The folded flag from her locker sitting in front of her like a prayer she didn't know how to say. Her phone showed 19 missed calls. 12 text messages. One email from Naval Intelligence marked urgent, cover compromised. Investigation suspended. Return to Norfolk for reassignment. 18 months of work. Dozens of military families who would never get justice because their cases depended on her documentation, her evidence, her continued presence as someone Pierce trusted. Gone. All of it gone because she chose one child over the mission. Her daughter appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, still in her after-school clothes, her backpack dragging behind her. "Mommy, why are you home when the sun is still up?" Sarah looked at her child. Looked at the folded flag. Looked at her hands that had just held a boy's life together, and she had no answer that wouldn't break both of them. The hospital board conference room smelled like old coffee and institutional dread. Long mahogany table. Fluorescent panels casting everything in that particular grey light that made people look guilty whether they were or not. Dr. Pierce sat at the center, a stack of surgical logs before him like evidence at a trial, because that's exactly what this was. Sarah stood at the far end of the room in civilian clothes, jeans, navy sweater, the folded flag still in her jacket pocket, though no one here knew what it meant. The hospital administrator, 2 board members, and a lawyer whose name Sarah hadn't registered. Pierce's voice carried the precision of a man who'd prepared for this exact moment. The patient was compromised by an authorized intervention, he said, tapping the falsified logs with one manicured finger. These records clearly document that Ms. Chen performed emergency decompression without physician oversight, without credentialing approval, without any authorization whatsoever. This constitutes reckless endangerment and violation of every patient safety protocol Cedar Creek Medical maintains. Sarah's hands remained flat on the table. Her jaw didn't move. The lawyer shifted papers. One of the board members made a note. And then the door opened. Marcus Reston wheeled himself into the conference room, his grandmother pushing from behind, his bandages removed for the first time, his eyes, those eyes that hadn't seen anything in 3 years, wide and clear and fixed on Sarah's face. The room stopped. Actually stopped, like someone had hit pause. Marcus reached forward, his small hand extending across the table, his voice barely above a whisper but cutting through the silence like a blade. "Reaper." The word detonated everything. Pierce's face went the color of hospital walls. The lawyer's pen froze mid-note. One of the board members stood without meaning to, as if the word itself had jerked him upright. Sarah's composure didn't crack, she never would let it crack here, not in front of him, but something shifted behind her eyes. The boy was staring at her like he was seeing a ghost made solid, and maybe he was. His father had called her Reaper. Not once in her presence, but enough times that a blind 8-year-old had learned to speak it like a prayer. Marcus's grandmother was holding a piece of paper, cream-colored, official-looking, and her voice when she read it was steady as stone. Captain Sarah Chen, Naval Special Warfare Medical Corps, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Tikrit, in direct support of Operation Iraqi Freedom, in recognition of her actions under fire and her willingness to place herself in the line of enemy fire to provide medical aid to wounded personnel. She paused. The silence was so thick you could perform surgery in it. The citation is signed by the commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Group 1. My son kept this, you understand. He kept it with him through 3 deployments. He wrote on the envelope, if anything happens to me, find Reaper. Trust Reaper. He meant his son. He meant her. The door opened again. A man in navy dress whites, 2 stars on his shoulder board, a rear admiral, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, walked into that conference room and rendered a crisp salute to Sarah Chen as she quietly, methodically unpinned the decorations from her bag and affixed them to her dress whites. Bronze star. Silver star. 2 purple hearts. And then, final, a Navy cross. The general's hand came up again, another salute, and this time everyone in the room understood that they were looking at a legend standing in scrubs and jeans, a woman who'd been cleared to operate on a child because she'd operated on soldiers on operating tables made of desert sand. Pierce opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. This is irrelevant to the matter at hand. Rank doesn't authorize unauthorized surgical procedures. His voice cracked on the word unauthorized, and that was the moment he lost control completely. That was the moment every strategic advantage he'd built began to collapse like a controlled demolition. She was still operating outside her scope of practice. She was still. The Admiral turned to look at him, and Pierce's voice simply stopped working, the way voices do when they encounter something they're not equipped to handle. The Admiral didn't speak. Didn't need to. He just looked at Pierce the way a predator looks at prey that doesn't even realize it's being hunted. The video hit social media 40 minutes later. Someone in that conference room had a phone, had been recording, and within 2 hours the footage was everywhere. Dr. Pierce's voice shouting, "She's just a nurse," while Admiral Caldwell, the man's name was Admiral James Caldwell, a decorated combat commander with 30 years of service, rendered a formal salute to Captain Sarah Chen while her citations gleamed. 2 million views by midnight. 8 million by morning. News helicopters circled Cedar Creek Medical. Cable news ran the clip on repeat with Chiron screaming "Decorated war hero fired for saving child" and combat medic branded "just a nurse," and Pierce's phone began receiving calls that would dismantle everything he'd constructed. His medical school mentor at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Robert Kellerman, the man who'd written Pierce's residency recommendation 22 years ago, released a public statement that was, for academic medicine, the equivalent of a thermonuclear device. "I am horrified and ashamed that someone I trained and recommended would demonstrate such profound disrespect toward a service member who saved lives under fire, such disregard for patient welfare, and such contempt for the actual meaning of medical service. I call for immediate comprehensive investigation into all of Dr. Pierce's clinical practices and billing records." Kellerman's letter was published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, a platform that guaranteed it would reach every hospital administrator in the country. Within 48 hours, Cedar Creek Medical's internal audit team found what Sarah had been documenting all along: 18 months of fraudulent billing. $847,000 in charges to military insurance for experimental procedures that Pierce had billed as a cutting-edge medical innovation while actually using substandard components that he received kickback payments to implant. More damning, the complications in Marcus Reston's implant, the ones that had nearly killed him, had been caused by the inferior device Pierce had chosen specifically because it paid him $5,200 per procedure more than the approved alternative. The state medical board suspended his license pending criminal investigation. Federal prosecutors opened a case. Pierce's attorney began negotiations that would end with a guilty plea on 12 counts of fraud and conspiracy. His hospital privileges were revoked. His partnership offers dissolved. His consulting contracts with 3 major device manufacturers were terminated with clauses that prohibited any severance, any negotiation, any mercy. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning at 7:30 a.m., Dr. Richard Pierce sat at his empty desk in an empty office at Cedar Creek Medical and accepted a phone call from a rural clinic in eastern Colorado. "We need someone to drive medical supplies between our satellite locations," a voice said. "The pay is $28,000 a year. We understand there are circumstances regarding your current availability." Pierce looked at his framed diplomas, already packed. At his hands, the same hands that had performed thousands of surgeries, now reduced to delivery routes. Through his office window, he could see the hospital garden, where Sarah Chen stood with Marcus Reston, where the boy's fully restored vision caught the sunlight as he showed Sarah's 6-year-old daughter how to fold paper cranes, each crease careful and deliberate. His mentor's words echoed in Pierce's mind, "You had every advantage, Richard. She had a mission. That's the difference between us and them." He said yes to the rural clinic job. What else was there to say? Sarah never looked up from the garden. She didn't need to. Her entire career, her real career, the one that mattered, had been built on situational awareness. She knew he was there. She knew he was watching. She knew he understood, finally, what it meant to lose everything you thought defined you. Marcus reached for her hand, his small fingers finding hers with the confidence of someone who could see again, could trust what his eyes told him. The folded flag in Sarah's jacket pocket, the one she'd touched 1,000 times through her isolation, through her fear, through the moment she'd had to choose between her cover and a child's life, that flag finally felt like what it was supposed to be. not a burden of secrets. A promise kept to a man who'd called her Reaper and trusted her to protect what mattered most. The hospital would offer her a new position directing military liaison programs. Naval Intelligence would close its investigation with 14 arrests across 4 states, a network of medical billing corruption targeting veterans and their families dismantled. The Navy would officially acknowledge her undercover service, though the details would remain classified for another decade. But none of that mattered as much as Marcus Reston's laugh, clear and bright and full of a future he could finally see coming toward him. If you've made it this far, you already know that the quiet ones, the ones everyone underestimates, they're often the ones holding everything together when the world starts to break. Subscribe to this channel, because we tell stories about people just like this, warriors and healers who change everything without ever asking for recognition. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated and proven everyone wrong. Comment below, what would you have done in Sarah's position? Would you have protected the investigation or saved the child? The answer says something important about who you are. Thank you for watching.